This is Josh from Indiana, they, them, inexplicable experience and how to parse that from a scientific standpoint. Josh, hit us with it. Can you hear us?
Hey guys, how you doing? Long-time listener, first-time caller. Thank you so much. The work that you do is wonderful.
Thank you, Josh. We appreciate you calling.
So, background. I was raised hyper-Christian, enough said. Evangelical, speaking in tongues, the whole jimmy jam.
Okay.
I never really bought into that. There was just no substance to it.
Okay.
As I got older, I disavowed myself of structure and kind of just tried to interact with my life and what I experienced. I wound up, 16 years ago, starting to do ceremony with the Lakota Nation. And I got to be honest, I've listened to you guys for a long time, and I've talked to my wife about this. She's an anthropologist, food anthropology. And she's come to a lot of different ceremonies with me, and she was like, yeah, I get it, but what about what we've seen in ceremony? I'm curious as to how, I should approach that because I'm theist adjacent. I'm not certain that there is a God. To be honest with you guys, I'm not certain of much of anything. I've had enough strange experiences, genuinely strange, that I'm curious as to how you guys would approach that. I'm more here to listen than to talk, because I've seen some unusual things, and I am also a critically minded person. So how would you guys approach that kind of introspection?
Yeah, I've got an approach that I use, and it's actually the same approach that I use in medicine. So essentially, we're going to do a differential diagnosis of this, whatever experience you want to talk about. So pick any experience that you feel like is not well explained, and we're just going to think through, start off by thinking through 3 possible causes for that experience. And one of them can be a supernatural experience. That can be in your list of differentials, if you will. Some other things could be, was I tired that day? Did I not eat enough that day? Did somebody tell me about this thing and now my brain is wanting to believe in that direction? Something like medication effects, things like hallucination, of course, can be on the list, but other things, if you found, because I've had these conversations with people who believe in Bigfoot before, if you see footprints on the ground, is this another animal that made the footprint? Is it an artist that went into the forest and drew a footprint? Think of any differential you can come up with, any possible explanation for this thing in front of you. And it can be as realistic or imaginary as you want. Just come up with 3 is kind of the minimum number you should think of, but feel free to explore and write down every single thing you can think of. And then the task after that is to take all of these things that you've written down and then say, what would I need to do to demonstrate that this is the correct one? And you can kind of write out this is the evidence that I have, and then assign it to each one saying this is in favor of this thing. So if I didn't eat enough that day, okay, that's some evidence that, could go towards any number of my differentials. Additionally, if I know that I hadn't used any psychoactive substances in the past 24 hours, maybe that's evidence against certain differentials. But you kind of list out what evidence goes to each one, but then additionally, what more information do I need? What else do I need to do to demonstrate that this is or isn't true. And so you're giving everything kind of an equal chance of being the correct one. And you kind of slowly rule them out or rule them in. And so then your list gets smaller and smaller. And the thing that's really nice about these exercises is there's a psychological phenomenon called anchoring, and it's a type of bias where the thing that is that your brain already wants to believe is the thing that you're going to keep going back to. And you're going to think, oh, I have so much evidence for this thing. This is absolutely what it is. But the more things you write out and the more things you explore, the more likely you are to pull yourself away from that anchor and find something else. So the danger that a lot of us run into is anchoring bias. And so the way to overcome that is to give yourself more things and to not focus only on your anchor. And you can go as in depth or as superficial as you want with this exercise, but I think it's very helpful to at least make you aware of where your anchor is and that there are other possibilities that maybe you didn't immediately think of. And it's nice to do this exercise with other people too, to bring in other perspectives that you didn't even think of in the beginning.
See, I have a much, much simpler answer to this question. And I love your answer. Your answer is fantastic. My answer would be, one of my favorite things about being a human being, especially a human being that believes in science, is that we are never done discovering new, true stuff. Every time that science finds an answer, we have an opportunity for that answer to evolve and to change and to discover new things, right? Back in the past, we thought certain things were good for us. We now know are deadly. We thought we knew the steps that it took for certain processes to happen. And now we know there's even more micro steps that happen within those processes. And so when I run into things that I can't explain, I'm fine with the fact that I can't explain those things, because I know that the more we research, the more we continue to support science and scientists and studies and mental health and things like that, I think the more we will come to answers and conclusions that we didn't have before. I think we have to have the ability to say, I don't know. We have to have the ability to say some things can't be explained. And we have to continue to believe that science will show us, that studies will show us, that archaeology will show us, and hopefully one day we'll have a very meaningful explanation for things like that happen. But we shouldn't be afraid of them, and we should enjoy them, and we should continue to always seek knowledge and to learn and to admit that we're not always going to know everything and have answers for everything. If that...
Yeah, sure. So I absolutely adore both of those answers. In response to number one, I have done that. I really have, because when I was younger, I was a magician, like a stage magician. And I did a lot of study into spiritualism and the way that they did those things. You know what I mean? The different, very ingenious methodologies that they use to trick people. So, that's kind of part of my background. Also, as you pointed out, lack of sleep, lack of food, all of that is a very real consideration, obviously. I can't, man. So there's a ceremony called a Yaweepi ceremony, and I'll not go too deep into it. I've been in about 8 or 9 of them. Every person who does it, it's a little unique. But there was one in particular that was done in a community center of all places, in the deep country of Indiana, where something actually reached from behind me through a concrete block. And I could actually feel it. It was just.
Did you see this happen, or did you feel it? I want to ask some questions because.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah. Did when you say that, did you see the thing that was reaching from behind you, or did you just feel it?
The Uweepi ceremony is done in complete darkness, so I did not see a goddamn thing.
Okay. So we have a sense. We have a sense that was blunted. We have a sense that was blunted here. And there's a lot of ways that your senses can be tricked, and it sounds like there are variables here that you don't know. Like there's a visual variable that you're missing in this equation. And going kind of using Sydney's example and combined with mine, because this is a point I didn't mention, and she makes a very good point. Like there's always going to be a variable, at least one, a whole category of variables that are the unknowns. And you can never rule out something that you just don't know. The question is kind of later on in that process, like, is the likelihood of an unknown variable enough to like change the way I think about this problem? And that's a very legitimate consideration. But like, there's definitely some things with this that are some unknown variables. Right. And in this one especially, there are significant unknown variables that actually do may likely confound the data. Like the fact that you have, it sounds very stigmatizing when we talk about like a hallucination, because of course it makes you feel like you can't trust your brain and can't trust your experiences. But like we all have like very mild hallucinations very frequently, like having tactile hallucinations can be very common, like where you feel like something brushed up against you and nothing actually did. Or you feel like you heard something and you didn't actually hear it. Like if you're in public and someone says a word, you think it was your name, but it wasn't your name. You don't actually know this person. Like we all have those experiences. And so that has to be higher up on the differential than something like a spiritual experience. And so like when someone has a situation like this, like I feel like the more you describe your experience, the more we can break down the details of what specifically happened. And even in talking about it, there's probably a lot of details that you don't remember because your brain kind of tuned out during that time. And so that's something that we have to factor in as well, is, are you remembering this correctly? And a lot of times we have selective attention and we can only focus on a certain number of stimuli at once. And so like, are there factors with this where you felt a thing? And I'm not going to discount that you had this experience. Like, I will never say that you didn't experience this, but did you experience this in its entirety? Or are there pieces that you don't remember, or is pieces that you weren't aware of at the time? And I think,
yes, that's the case.
Right. And so there's more work then that needs to happen before I can say that this is unexplainable and of supernatural origin. Like those, it's going to take a lot more work to get there. And I feel like so often people will do a minimum amount of work investigating this, and then they'll chalk it up. They'll be like, oh, I ruled everything else out, so this is the thing that's left over.
Well, but and I have a bit of a personal
You may not have.
And I have a bit of a personal anecdote that I feel like lines up a lot, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, with what you're talking about. So quick backstory. I'll make it quick. There was a night where my mom was in the hospital, wide awake. She's not under anesthesia. She's never been under anesthesia, or she hadn't been during that hospital trip. And she watched as water started pouring into her room. She was awake. She was wide awake. And the water began to fill the room. So obviously she's freaking out because her room is filling with water. It gets to the point where it's up on her bed and she's getting wet from this rising water. And she freaks out and she starts screaming. And when the nurses come in, they open the door and they let the water out of the room. But it was real. She felt it. The water was there. She heard the trickling of the water pour in. She saw the whole thing happen. And she couldn't figure out what was going on. She thought she was losing her mind. She was not on any hallucinogenic drugs. A few weeks later, my brother is a little kid. I think he was 6 or 8, wakes up in the middle of the night screaming. There are spiders all over his room. He says there are spiders on his bed. He can feel them crawling. He can see them on the ceiling. Nobody else can see them. Both of them had taken Benadryl, and they discovered that they're allergic to Benadryl, or maybe it's not an allergy. They can't have Benadryl.
It's a legitimate side effect.
Yes, they felt the spiders, they saw the spiders, or my mom, it was water, you know, but she says she remembers clear as day that she could splash this water and it was filling her room and she was wide awake. She was not woken up. She was not under anesthesia. Same with my brother. And to date, they cannot take Benadryl. When I take Benadryl, I'm totally fine. I don't hallucinate. I don't see anything. But there was a time where she had no idea what happened and nobody could give her an answer. And now they know that it's Benadryl. So it could be something like that, something you have been able to do or take or eat or inhale your entire life. And one day you just can't anymore. And that's, I think, where research and science and experimentation can explain things that you truly felt that thing on your skin. You felt it. But perhaps there is a reason other than it being there for you to feel that.
So what if I wasn't the only person who had that experience? And the way that I found out that information was by asking people, what was that like for you?
Well, here's my thought, just based on, and of course we could go into more detail about how this ritual was performed, and that would give me even more information. But even something simple as like, there's something behind you that touched you, like through this concrete, as you say. Like, this was a planned ceremony, like in a community center. Like, how did we rule out that there wasn't something behind you that somebody had placed there that you couldn't see because it was dark?
Like people pushing the piece on a Ouija board.
How did we rule that? How did we rule out that?
That's possible.
So why is that less likely? So you're saying it's possible. So did we adequately rule out the simple things before jumping to like that this is unexplainable? Like, if it's still possible, what more do we need to do to rule that in or out?
See, that's kind of where I'm at. Because like when I tell you that I've been really considering this for a number of years, I mean that very seriously. What
would happen if you did that? What would happen if you did this ritual with the lights on? Have you ever asked them if they would do the ritual with the lights on?
I have not. Funny side note, I have actually been present when a kid turned the lights on because they got scared. And just basically what happened was like you heard a rattle sound and everything was normal. It's really strange, man. I've been in a lot of these different ceremonies. I've actually like poured sweats myself for a number of years. I did.
Sweating is part of your like physiological response to emotion. So you could have certain emotions and have that happen. Like, I feel like, Josh, like I feel like you've had these experiences, and I feel like you want this to be something else. Like, even if you're not consciously thinking that that's what you want, like, it's by the logical steps you're taking. You have, like, you say that you've looked into these things like to their full extent, and then now you're kind of at the tail end. I think based on our conversation, you have more work to do.
That's very possible, man.
I think that's what you need to do. I think you need to take a step back, figure out where you're anchoring, and try to make that not an anchor. Try to correct that bias. And then, like, sure, it's still on the differential that this is a spiritual source, but
right.
we haven't ruled out these other things. And I think, like, the way you need to do it is kind of isolate some of these variables and essentially make a study about it. And
don't forget also that statistically,
how would I do that though? That's honestly my question: is how would I actually go about that as a person? I am not a classically trained scientist. I have a fair amount of education. So how would you recommend, like, as a trained doctor, Like, how would I actually undergo that process? Like, how would I do that? What would be the best way?
Yeah. So ideally, you could do a larger scale experiment, but that's not going to be probably feasible. But figuring out what variables you can isolate that might be confounding the data, such as the lights being off. Like, is there a reason why they have to have these lights off? Is there something that they're hiding because the lights are off? Like, even going to different ceremonies, I mean, it might not be like feasible to go to different ceremonies of different communities, and seeing similarities, differences, et cetera, if the experience is the same across both. Having, even surveying people's experiences who go to these things, and letting them kind of anonymously write down kind of what they felt happened, et cetera. That can be like some preliminary data. But like ideally you get to a point where you could have like the ceremony performed in multiple different ways and seeing how the difference changes. For example, like with the lights on, I don't know, in a different building, like figuring out, like I'm kind of word selling a little bit because it's hard since we were kind of short on time and not able to get the full story of the ceremony. But I encourage you to look into some of the studies, like about supernatural experiences and how they designed them. Like the one about prayer with healing, that can kind of teach you, how do I isolate, how do I create study groups, and how do I isolate these variables? Because you're going to need a control group, you're going to need like an experimental group at minimum, and then like it's a lot to undertake, and it might not be fully feasible, but there's some variables that you could look into through some of those study methods. So I'd say go like do a literature review, go find some sources, and then maybe call back about, and then we can have a longer discussion about study design.
Well, and also I would like to add, we can't forget that humans are known to change what they remember about certain experiences based on what everybody else says. So it's actually not unusual at all for humans to say, oh my gosh, I felt that too. Oh my gosh, I heard that too. I did. And that's not actually true. There are ample studies that show us that human beings change their memories or change their experiences and their feelings based on what they're told they should have felt or tasted or heard. And they don't even realize they're doing it on purpose. It's not malicious at all. So there's that factor to look into as well. What does it take for human beings to change their experience that they swear up and down that they felt or they heard or they tasted or they smelled or whatever, based on what they've been told they should have or what they've been told they did experience? So that's... Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing, you could learn to do the ritual yourself, or have somebody else who is not like part of the group try to perform the exact same things, and then see like have a placebo person leading the ceremony, like to where nobody knows that there's that they weren't trained. So you have to be creative on how you do this. Like even take people from outside of the community who have never been exposed to this ritual before, have them go to the actual ritual, and then have those same people go to the ritual that was performed by somebody who wasn't like an official person supposed to do it, and then see what the responses are.
Yes, that's a really interesting, like, see, the thing about doing stuff like that is there is just a kind of inherent nature of disrespect to doing something like that. And I mean, man, like, I'm a white guy who has been let into like native spiritual beliefs.
Do you think that there is somebody from that community who does not believe in the spiritual nature of the practice and could serve in that role?
No. Oddly enough, I don't.
You don't think that there are any native people like from those cultures that aren't spiritual?
Close enough to any of them to be able to do that.
So you just don't know any, which is fine. Like that's a resource restriction.
Yeah.
But there are ways that you could do it without being disrespectful, I think. Because like it sounds like it's, and I'm gonna be careful about how I say this, but it's important to respect cultures and cultural practices. There's a different reverence that we give to indigenous religion than we do to other religion. Like if we're going to take the beliefs as they are, we should be just as critical of indigenous beliefs as we are of like Christianity. Like the beliefs themselves should be left up to scrutiny.
That's fair.
And I think that I think that like it wouldn't be inherently disrespectful to try to demonstrate those claims. I do think you can be, there's some specific ways that you can take to be respectful while you're doing that. But I think maybe we're like extra cautious with some of these things and are like often more willing to believe something from an indigenous group than another one because of, I don't know.
I mean, for me, it more comes down to the fact that they have been heavily oppressed and they have not shared their information with a lot of people as a result of that.
Okay, but
has been a beneficiary. Yeah. Like, I want to respect it as much as I can, right? Like, just want to respect it as much as I can.
But that doesn't mean you have to believe it.
You say,
and that doesn't mean, and it's not like.
The same way that I would cover my head in parts of the world that want me to cover my head out of respect for the location that I'm at, whether it be like a temple of some sort, that doesn't mean I believe any of the reasoning behind why they do it, but I'm showing respect for that culture and that community by following the rules. And so just because you are willing to say, this is a different culture, this is a different place, this is how they do things, I want to be respectful of their culture, this is how I'm going to act while I'm here, does not mean that you have to consent to believing what they believe and that you're adopting their belief system in any way. It just means that while you're in their space and while you're taking their time and their resources, or you're in their temples or forests or wherever you happen to be, that you are showing that you recognize this is what they prefer. And so you're willing to do a few things here and there to be respectful of what you know their beliefs to be without adopting those as your own beliefs.
Yeah, sure. I think that's perfectly fair. Well, hey, listen, guys, it's been really amazing talking with you. It's been super helpful. Thank you so much. I just genuinely respect everything that you guys do. And maybe we'll talk again in the future. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
Thanks for calling.
Please call in again.